Okay, so we're moving into meditation 6 today, which is the last meditation of the series. And I want to just remind you of how we sort of got into the situation that we did get into in the first place with these meditations. So recall the two worlds hypothesis. The two worlds hypothesis states, A, on the one hand, there's an objective external world, which is independent of us, right? So when we're gone, that objective world is still going to be there. But the only way we ever know anything about that objective world is through our minds, right? So what we know about this objective world, which is independent of our minds, is mediated through our minds, right? So anything I know through sense experience, right, is known through my mind, right? Because that is a mental experience. When I see a tree, there is a mental representation of a tree and a mental experience of the tree. When I think about the nature of physical bodies, right, I've got an idea in my mind about what physical bodies are. In each of those instances, what I have is a content of the mind, which is mediating what I think about the external world, right? So two claims there. On the one hand, there is an objective world out there independent of my mind. The only way I make contact with that objective world is through my mind. Okay, so that's the two worlds hypothesis. And then the skeptical worry arises from there. Well, how do I know that my ideas or my experiences about the external world really are matching up with the way things are out there? Like, what if the external world is totally different than any idea or experience I have of it? That's the skeptical worry, right? That's the epistemological worry that begins this whole project for Descartes. And we saw that the way in which Descartes eventually attempts to close this gap is by saying, look, it might be that there is a total disconnect between what I think is going on in the external world and what is going on in the external world. But he says, even if that were true, there's one thing that I can know with absolute certainty, that I exist as a thinking thing. And while that doesn't get us all the way to closing the gap to saying, okay, now I can know the external world exists, Descartes thinks it is the fundamental starting point of philosophy and is the basis upon which the rest of his epistemology will be built. That he exists as this res cogitans, as this thinking thing, right? And that is the first two meditations, which we covered over the past 2 weeks. What Descartes then goes on to do is interesting. Over meditations 3, 4, and 5, he goes on to prove that, well, to his own satisfaction at least, that God exists. Okay, so he gives a couple of arguments for God's existence. In the 5th meditation, he actually gives an ontological argument. We're not going to cover it because the arguments are sort of complex and there's many of them that occur throughout those meditations. So I'm just giving you the essential idea here of what Descartes' move is. It's to say I exist as a thinking thing. He then goes on to say, and I have an idea of God, and that God really does exist. Via an ontological argument, he says, if I've got the idea of God, well, then necessarily God must exist. Okay, and what he says about God is that God isn't a deceiver. He says God isn't a deceiver. All right, that's one of the things that he establishes. He says, look, I might be confused about some things sometimes, right? Like when I see an object far off in the distance, I think it's small when in fact it's very large. I can be confused about things like that, but I can't be confused about things which are like fundamental truths, what he calls clear and distinct ideas, right? So what he's going to say is, look, God makes it so that the things that I can check with my mind, the things that I can know rationally, are in fact fundamentally true. God wouldn't deceive me about the really important stuff. So my clear and distinct ideas, I know that God can make anything that I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true, right? And so in the 6th meditation, what we're moving into now, Descartes' going to say, and it's the case that I have a clear and distinct perception of the difference between my mind and my body. He says he clearly and distinctly perceives that. And what he means is that he perceives that the mind is a fundamentally different sort of thing than the body. And he understands this as a kind of analytical or logical truth. And he says, since God isn't a deceiver and he makes it so that what I clearly and distinctly perceive is true, and since I clearly and distinctly perceive the difference between my mind and my body, the mind and the body must really exist separately from each other. The conclusion there that the epistemological concern was helping us arrive at was that the body really does exist. Because if there really is a difference between the mind and the body, then the body really does exist. And Descartes is going to say the external world really does exist. I can know this with certainty. And even though I might get some things wrong from time to time because my senses can be distorted or something like that, I can correct for that by using mathematics, by employing physics. I can really know about the physical external world. So in this sixth meditation, Descartes is going to say, finally, we've arrived at the place where we can say the external world really exists. We don't have to worry about all this dreamed out and so on and so forth. What our target today is going to be, though, is actually a different sort of question than the kind of question Descartes has been asking up to this point. What we're going to attempt to grapple with today is what Descartes is referring to when he's talking about the difference between the mind and the body, that third premise there. I clearly and distinctly perceive the difference between mind and body. That leads him to assert a metaphysical claim as opposed to an epistemological one, namely that the mind and the body really are fundamentally different sorts of things. And that's going to be our target for today. And what I want to do real quick is just, I was just saying that our concern is sort of shifting now, right? Our emphasis is shifting. We're moving from a concern about epistemology, from what we can know to be true, whether or not the external world exists, and so forth, to a question of metaphysics, right? To a question about what fundamentally does exist. What is the nature of what exists? So what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is the attempt to say what really is. It's an attempt to give an account of sort of the ultimate or fundamental constituents of reality. So another way of framing this question is that the metaphysician is asking questions like, what is most fundamentally real? What is the fundamental nature of reality? What are the basic constituents of the real world? When we're thinking about epistemological issues, recall, we're asking a question about what we can know. For instance, we wanted to establish that we can know that an external world exists beyond our senses. When we begin asking metaphysical questions, what we now want to ask as a question is, okay, so if we can know that an external world does exist, what is the nature of that reality that does in fact exist? Yeah, what is its basic constituents or its basic features? So that's the difference between epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology asks the question, what can I know about, right? What are the criteria for me having knowledge that some belief is true? Like we saw Descartes' criteria, right? I need to know, I need to be able to not be able to doubt that the belief is true. That's the fundamental criteria for whether or not I have knowledge about some belief. The metaphysical question then moves over into asking, so what is the nature then of what really does exist? What is its fundamental characteristic? So you should be able to see here that epistemological and metaphysical questions are closely intertwined with one another. An epistemological question might give way to a metaphysical question, and vice versa. A metaphysical question might give way to an epistemological question. So we've moved from this epistemological concern, what can I know about? And now we're going to start asking these metaphysical questions. What is the nature of this mind? What is the nature of this thinking thing, this cogito? What is the nature of the body, the physical body? And then there's a further question here. How do the mind and the body interact? Yeah, how is one causally influenced by the other? And this is a metaphysical question. It's a question about the fundamental constituents of reality. What are they? What are they? And how do they work? Further on in the course, we're going to see metaphysical questions like, does the self really exist? Right? So that's a question about what is real? What is fundamentally real? Is the self a substantial entity or not? That's coming further in the course. We're going to ask further metaphysical questions like, do we have free will? Or are our actions fully determined? What is the fundamental nature of the will? Is it free? That is a metaphysical question, a question about the nature of reality. So I just wanted to frame that for us to make sure that we have a sense of the kind of question that we're going to be exploring in the lecture today and on Wednesday and also into the coming weeks. So to recap this a little bit, the two worlds hypothesis, we were looking at the two worlds hypothesis as an epistemological hypothesis, right? About what we can know. But there's also a way of interpreting the two worlds hypothesis as a metaphysical hypothesis about what really is, about what fundamentally exists, right? So on the one hand, we're asserting that an external world exists beyond our senses, and the only way in which we know about that world is through the mediation of our mind. So we can see that there are metaphysical questions sort of smuggled into the epistemological hypothesis. So now we can ask the question, what is the nature of that external world? What's its fundamental nature? And what's the nature of this mind that knows about the external world? And how is it that they interact with each other, right? So the epistemological hypothesis is then there is an objective external world. So now we're there, right? We're back to assuming that the external world exists. We don't have to worry about evil demons and dream doubt anymore. There is an objective external world, which is publicly accessible to us via observation and measurement. Yeah. So it seems like, hey, there really is this life that occurs in the physical world. And we can know about what's going on in the physical world by measuring it, right? It's publicly available to all of us through our third person perspectives. We can know about like what really does exist in this objective external world. But on the other hand, there also still seems to be this subjective internal world, which is only accessible to us privately through direct introspection, right? So this is the idea that, hey, I might be deceived about whether or not the tree really exists, but there's something that it's like for me to perceive the tree. And that's something that I can know by looking at my own mind, by examining the contents of my consciousness. And I know about this privately. It's not publicly accessible, right? So you can't just take a look at the experiences that I'm having in my inner private theater, right? In some sense, that's totally off limits to you, just as your private inner mental world is off limits to me in terms of having direct access to it. There's something essentially introspective and private about this life of the mind. Now, this doesn't mean that I can't tell when you're like angry or sad, or you have something to say about how you're feeling. You can, your behaviors, for instance, give me an indication of what your mental state is. Your verbal reports can also give me an indication about what your mental state is, but I never have direct access to your mental states in the way in which we all seem to have direct access to that which is publicly available and observable and measurable, right? Because we can all look at the outer behavior, or we can all analyze the reports that are given about how somebody feels or the type of experiences that they have. But the only way to ever know what it's like to undergo a certain experience is to undergo it yourself, or to have that mental state yourself. And so the two worlds hypothesis here is now moving us into this metaphysical concern, that there does seem to be these two different sorts of life that we live. A publicly accessible life, the life of the body, which is observable and measurable, and then this private inner life of the mind, which is available to us only when we introspect, only when we observe the contents of what is going on in our experience. And now we have this metaphysical puzzle. How can it be that there are these two different worlds, right? And if there are these two different worlds, how do they interact with each other? What's the relationship between the mind and the body on this account? Okay, so that's the move from epistemology into metaphysics. So what I want to talk about now is this position that Descartes establishes in the sixth meditation here, known as substance dualism, which is a massively influential theory of mind, one that has shaped the philosophical tradition in an indelible way, right? So really, everything that happens in the philosophy of mind, right, which is a contemporary branch of philosophy, really stems from the work that Descartes did in the Meditations. And this idea of dualism is the primary crux upon which most issues in philosophy of mind depend. Okay, so let's take a look at this idea of substance dualism. It should actually already be pretty clear to us at this point, but we'll recap some of what we've already talked about. Are there any questions or confusions before we begin? Is everything pretty clear so far? Are we all on board with this move from epistemology over to metaphysics? Doing okay? Yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and make the move. Okay, so what is this position of substance dualism? Well, this is the idea that fundamentally reality can be distinguished in terms of two distinct sorts of substances, mind and body. So for Descartes, there's fundamentally two different types of stuff in the universe. There's mental stuff on the one hand, mind stuff or consciousness. And on the other hand, there is physical stuff, the body. These are two fundamentally different sorts of substances, right? Fundamental constituents of reality that exist. Now, Descartes did think there was a third substance, namely God, who upon whom mind and body are ultimately dependent. But for our purposes, we're just going to be thinking about the mind and the body and their potential relation to each other. So the view is that minds are distinct from bodies and bodies are distinct from minds. There are two fundamentally different sorts of things. Another way of putting this same point is that mental processes are distinct from physical processes, and physical processes are distinct from mental processes. And this is a really sort of puzzling point to consider if you haven't considered it before. So what is like a characteristically physical process? Well, we often think of like chemical processes. If we're thinking about the physical body, we're probably thinking about certain neurochemical reactions occurring in the brain, permeating the physical body, which lead to certain outward behavioral signs. So for instance, if I want to demonstrate the connection between the mind and the body, I might say something like, hey, look, I can voluntarily raise my hand in the air. I'm raising my hand in the air. There seem to be two different ways of describing what's going on here. On the one hand, I can describe it as a physical process. So I can describe the synaptic firings in the brain leading to certain chemical and electrical signals being sent to the central nervous system, causing my muscles to contract, which lead to the raising of the hand, right? So I've just described this physical state of affairs according to this physical process, this neurochemical process, which leads to muscle contractions and the raising of the hand and so forth. But on the other hand, I can describe this very same event in terms of the mental processes that are at play, namely the decision that I came to demonstrate the distinction between mind and body by raising my hand voluntarily in the air, right? That seems to be a mental event, the way in which I just described that, right? I didn't make reference to neuronal firings and to muscle contractions and so forth. I made reference to a mental state, to the decision to raise my hand. So notice that when I describe the mental process, I don't need to rely on the terms that I use to describe the physical process. And vice versa, when I'm describing the physical process, I don't need to rely on the terms that I use to describe the mental process. And what Descartes wants to say is the reason why we can give two different sorts of explanations for the seemingly very basic event of me raising my hand is because there are really two different sorts of things going on. There is an internal life of the mind, which is flowing down its particular mental or conscious stream. And then on the other hand, there is the plane of the physical body, in which there are chemical reactions and subatomic particles interacting with each other and so forth. And these are really two different sorts of processes occurring simultaneously in the universe. There is a life of the mind, an independent life of the mind, and an independent life of the body. The life of the body is public, it's open to observation and measurement, whereas this life of the mind is distinctly experienced by you as the experiencing subject. Yeah, so I'm just trying to make it as clear as possible that Descartes thinks the mind and the body are separate. They're two different sorts of things. There's a mental, non-physical substance, namely the mind, and a physical, extended substance, the body. And what Descartes thinks is, hey, since they're separate and distinct, the mind really can't exist without the body. Yeah. And if you grasp that Descartes thinks that, for instance, the mind, it's possible that the mind will survive the death of the body, right? Once this physical body perishes, the mind can still continue to exist. Then you'll have grasped the fundamental distinction between mind and body that Descartes is attempting to get at here. The mind is its own independent thing that can exist separately from the body. And so you might be able to see here too that in the position of substance dualism, there is, I think, oftentimes those who put forward a theory of substance dualism will be motivated by religious concerns. The existence of the soul after death, for instance, in an afterlife. Substance dualism is completely compatible with such a view, that the soul will continue to exist even after the body has perished, right? And that's the kind of picture that Descartes is presenting us with, and the kind of picture that he wants to be able to maintain even in the face of the power of mathematical physics, right? So this is really one of Descartes' fundamental concerns, is how do I continue to be able to assert the life of the soul even when we have these powerful ways of understanding the physical world through mathematical physics, observation, and measurement. And substance dualism seems like a theory of mind that is compatible with both a scientific picture of the world and a religious picture of the world. This is the idea of substance dualism, and maybe this will help a little bit further, right? You've got your physical body, right? This anatomical body, which we can understand in purely physical terms. It's extended in space. It exists in a particular place at a particular time. It's observable. It's measurable. I can go in and I can dissect the body. We don't want to do that to your body, but you know, this is how we make advancements, right? In medicine, is we actually go into the body and we understand the various organs of the body, and then even more advanced sciences, the the neurochemistry, right? The actual chemical structure and atomic structures which compose the physical organs of the body. All of that is understood in a purely physical way, right? So we've got our physical body. But then we also seem to have this life of the mind, which moves along in conjunction or coordinated with the body. And the mind is non-physical, right? I can't break down the parts of the mind in the way that I can break down the parts of the body, because it really doesn't even seem to take up any space. It's not occurring in anywhere, right? There's no specific place in which the mind is occurring. And it's not observable, right? Except for in your own case, maybe, right? When you look into your own mind and you see what's going on there. And it's certainly not measurable in the way that the body is measurable, right? We can't take your just experience of the beautiful sunset and figure out the sort of, electrical charge which is being passed from one synapse to another. Right? In your experience doesn't contain any of that. Your experience is just of the beautiful sunset. Okay, so that's the position of substance dualism. Are we clear on that? Do we have questions about?
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
The mind doesn't exist in a particular way place, but it does. It happens in the brain, so it has a particular place.
Okay, so it happens in the brain. So where in the brain does the mind happen?
It's definitely in the brain. It
definitely in the brain. So is there like a spot in my brain where my mind is? So I could as a neurosurgeon, right? I'll open up your skull. I'm just using you as an example, right? And I'll look inside and start taking apart the places of the brain and say, hey, Descartes said it was in the pineal gland, so let me go look in there. And I go and I look and I try and find the brain. I try and find the mind, but I never come across a mind, right? There's no mind that I find in the brain.
But there's a place that the process of the thinking happens in there. It doesn't happen in the stomach, for example. It is in the brain.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying thought seems to be correlated with the brain. Notice that that's a different sort of statement. If I say thinking seems to be correlated with some physical processes in the brain, it's not the same thing as saying thought is in the brain, right? Because if thought were really in the brain, I should be able to go into the brain and find thoughts. But I don't ever find thoughts, right? This is one of the weird things when people say, like, memory is stored in the brain, but you never go into the brain and find memories, right? I think more what you're trying to say, and I don't get me wrong, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing that you're saying, is that the mind is correlated with the brain in some way. Somehow these mental processes, this mental life, seems to be coordinated with this physical life. And in particular, it seems to be the kind of neuronal firings in the brain which are closely connected to these mental experiences that we have. Now, there's still an open question there, right? Because you might want to say something like, hey, maybe the mind just is those neural firings in the brain, right? That's what the mind is. But Descartes says, wait a second, that doesn't make sense, right? Because I can give a full-fledged physical explanation of everything going on in the body and still tell you nothing about what it's like to see the beautiful sunset. Because it seems to be a different sort of thing. Like the mind isn't analyzable. It's not accessible to us in the way that physical objects are accessible to us. The brain is something we can take apart, we can break it down into its component pieces, we can build it back up again and get this very powerful understanding of what's going on in the brain. But our mental life is not analyzable in those same terms. And Descartes says, well, that's because the mind is, it's just fundamentally different. It's a fundamentally different sort of thing. We're going to see some arguments in the next couple of weeks, which are going to assert that this picture is wrong, that substance dualism must be false, that the mind really is the brain in the way that you seem to be suggesting. But for now, we just got to hold on to what Descartes' picture is and see that there is some truth to it, right? So I really want you to see that even if Descartes gets some things wrong, there really are some profound insights that Descartes has about the mind and the body. Descartes' point is, hey, look, you can doubt that the physical world exists. Like, that's a conceivable doubt. It's conceivable that I'm in a dream right now and that I'm hallucinating everything which is happening. But even if that were the case, there'd still be something it's like to be me. There's still some point of view, some experience that I'm having. And since the physical world wouldn't enter into that explanation at all on this account, it must be that there's something more. Yeah, there's this extra bit of mental stuff which is somehow connected to the body, which is responsible for me having these experiential episodes. That's the extra bit of soul stuff, substance that Descartes wants in order to say, and that's what distinguishes me from just being a physical body. And I've also got a soul. I've got this consciousness, right? Which is different from the physical body. In fact, it's so different that I could continue to exist even if I didn't have a physical body. I could exist as a disincarnate intelligence. Yeah. That really is this is a picture of the soul or of the mind, which is extremely influential, right? Which says, hey, there's something really unique about you as a person. Like, you are fundamentally kind of special in this way, is that you're not just your body. You're not just a physical material thing. You're also a spiritual thing, right? You exist as a mind, as a soul. And you can continue to hold substance dualism, even if you don't want to bring in the spiritual connotations of things here, right? And just say, yeah, well, the mind's got to be a fundamentally different sort of thing than the body, just when we reflect upon the nature of these things. Okay, well then let's take a look at several of the arguments that Descartes gives for this position. Yeah, the first one, it's a little bit of a complicated argument. Hopefully I'm going to do an okay job at breaking this down for you. Here's the passage in which the first argument for substance dualism occurs in the sixth meditation. So it's long here, but I want us to be able to see how the argument comes out of this passage so that you can just recognize that what's going on here. So Descartes writes, I know that everything that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God to be exactly as I understand it. Okay, so there's a reference to God there, but what he's saying is, hey, if I clearly and distinctly understand something, then God could make that to actually be the case, that things really are the way in which I understand them. Okay, that's the point he's making there. The fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is therefore enough to make me certain that it is distinct from the other, since the things could be separated by God, if not by something else. Yeah, so Descartes saying, if I understand one thing as clearly distinct and separate from another thing, then God can make it that those things really are separate. And if he could make it so that they really are separate, then they really are in fact separate. Okay, we're going to break that down further in just a moment. Accordingly, from the fact I have gained knowledge of my existence without noticing anything about my nature or essence, except that I am a thinking thing, I can rightly conclude that my essence consists solely in the fact that there's a typo there, that I am a thinking thing. It's possible, or as I will say later, it's certain that I have a body which is very tightly bound to me. But on the other hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am just a thinking and unextended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of my body insofar as it is just an extended and unthinking thing. It's certain then that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Right? So he says, hey, what I found in those first two meditations was that I know clearly and distinctly that I exist as a thinking thing. And I understand that thinking thing as something which is thinking and unextended. So it thinks and it doesn't occur in any particular place, right? And this is the idea of himself that he's landed upon. And then he says, and I've understood the body too, right? I've understood that the body is fundamentally distinct from the mind. The body is extended and unthinking, right? So the piece of wax, it doesn't think, but it is extended in space. And that's its essence, is to be extended such that I could measure it, right? I could observe it and measure it. And look, I have a clear and distinct idea then of how the body is different from the soul, from the mind. And since God can make it that whatever I clearly and distinctly understand can really be that way, it must really be the case that the mind is distinct from the body. So I have these ideas of the distinction of mind and body, and Descartes says the fact that I can conceive of that is enough to show that the mind and body really are separate and distinct. Okay, so I'm going to try and rephrase that without invoking God here. So here would be the first premise of the argument. Anything that is conceivable is also logically possible. Okay, so anything that I can conceive of, which doesn't, for instance, result in a contradiction, is also logically possible. That is, it could really be made that way. Likewise, anything that is inconceivable is logically impossible, because anything that I can't conceive of is not really a possibility at all, right? I can't conceive, for instance, of a four-sided triangle, right? So it's impossible. It's logically impossible that a four-sided triangle exists because it's inconceivable. But a three-sided triangle whose angles sum to 180, that is conceivable, right? That makes perfect sense to my understanding. And of course, it is logically possible that triangles exist, and they do exist, in fact. So anything that's conceivable is also logically possible, and anything that is inconceivable is logically impossible. I take this to be what Descartes is saying in these first couple of sentences here. I know that everything that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God to be exactly as I understand it. The fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is therefore enough to make me certain that it is distinct from the other, since the things could be separated by God, if not by something else. Okay, so I think that's the statement of the first premise there. Anything that is conceivable is also logically possible. Okay, well, what's the next step? The next step in the argument is to say I can conceive of existing without my body. Yeah? I can conceive of existing without my body. So if we take premise 1 and premise 2 in conjunction with each other, it seems like the conclusion we have to come to is that it's logically possible that I exist without my body. That is, it really could be that way, that I exist without my body. And then he goes on and says, look, but I can't conceive of existing without my mind. Can you conceive of that state of affairs where you exist without your mind? I don't know, that seems a lot more difficult, right? If there's no mind, then it doesn't seem like there's any subject of experience, and so nobody who is existing. So Descartes wants to say, so it's logically impossible that I exist without my mind. You can't even conceive of it. I can perfectly conceive I exist without my body, but I can't conceive of existing without my mind. But the argument that Descartes is giving here is to say, hey, look, I can conceive of existing without my body, so that's a logical possibility. And I can't conceive of existing without my mind, so that's not a logical possibility. And what I've just done is I've clearly and distinctly understood that the mind and the body are logically separate from each other. Since I can conceive of existing without my body, but I can't conceive of existing without my mind, that shows that they're fundamentally separate and distinct. Because how else could I have a clear and distinct idea? How could I understand them apart from each other in terms of their essence, in terms of their fundamental nature? I can understand the fundamental nature of the mind without having to appeal to any sort of physical process. And I can understand a physical process without having to appeal to anything doing with the nature of mind. So I understand their essences separately from each other. And Descartes' conclusion here is that, well, they must really then be separate fundamentally. And this is his argument for substance dualism. He goes from there to say, since they are separate, they are two separate and distinct substances. The mind is a non-physical substance, and the body is a physical substance. And this is known as Descartes' conceivability argument. Is that possible? Is it possible to exist without a body? Well, that's the second premise there. And a lot hinges on this. Thomas was pointing out the first premise, and we'll go back to that first premise because it's an important one. But I want to start here and say, hey, is this really possible to exist without a body? Can you conceive of that? Okay, ghosts, right? So we have all sorts of stories, right? About ghosts. And this seems like a perfect instance where we are imagining a kind of a disincarnate intelligence, some kind of spirit that exists without a body. Yeah. So you might imagine, so let's just say I'm a really bad science fiction writer and I'm painting this story for you, right? You wake up in the morning, it's very dark, the sun hasn't risen yet. You're shuffling around for your alarm clock. You're still very groggy, right? It's early in the morning. Of course, you haven't had any coffee yet. You haven't put the caffeine in to wake up. You sort of stumble into the bathroom, half awake, half asleep. You seem to be splashing some water on your face, trying to wake up, and you flip on the light, ready for the brightness to hit your pupils and to illuminate the room and get you ready for the day. And then as you look into the mirror in front of you, you see nothing. You only see the wall behind you. Yeah, normally you'd see your face staring back at you, and suddenly you have this panic. You say, oh my God, I don't see myself. And you look down at your hands where your hands would normally be, but you don't see any hands. There's none present. And the panic starts to increase, and you say, my God, what has happened? Maybe I'm dead. Maybe I'm not even alive. So maybe if we had a better storyteller here, they could do a better job with this than I just did. But is a scenario like that conceivable? I mean, it seems like we just painted a picture of it, and better writers and storytellers will do an even better job at painting that picture for us than I could do. But that seems like something we can conceive at least might occur, even if it's not going to occur anytime soon in this world. Seems like something we can conceive of.
Couldn't we say that ghosts still like have a body? Like pretty much every, I guess, popular depiction of ghosts has them with eyes. And just like you need your mind for your senses, you also need, your body for the senses. You're not going to be able to see without eyes.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
Could we say like all the possible conceiving without a body? There's still a replacement body, such as a ghost, or say we upload our mind to a computer, and the computer's our body. So I feel like there has to be some sort of replacement body.
I hear what you're saying there, because it's just so hard for us to conceive of maybe existing without a body because we're so used to it, right? So even our depiction of ghosts, for instance, there's the sort of opaque outline of some being walking down the hallway or something like that. I suppose the question though is, even if we often do imagine ghosts that way, or we imagine maybe some kind of mind uploaded to a computer or something along those lines, which seems to require some physical hardware, is the picture that we just painted of you waking up in the morning and going to the mirror, turning on the lights, and only seeing the wall behind you in the mirror, so that your body is just not present at all? Is that conceivable? I mean, because it seems like even if we do have most of our descriptions of ghosts involve some kind of, physical ectoplasm or something like that, that it's still possible to conceive of a ghost which doesn't have any ectoplasmic basis, right? It's just kind of like a pure disincarnate intelligence without any physical substrate. I mean, because I take it that's what people are imagining when they're imagining ghosts, but they want to bring along this idea of ectoplasm, I think, right? To help explain how the intelligence could still exist without the physical body. And in fact, I think what people are often picturing there when they picture the ectoplasm is a kind of non-physical substance, which is precisely what Descartes has in mind, right? It's not a physical substance, right? Because it's not a body. It's a non-physical substance. Because your point, Alex, I think is correct that it still seems like you need something for these in which these mental events can occur, right? There's got to be something in which they can occur. And Descartes wants to say, yeah, they occur in this non-physical substance. It's not like other physical substances. It's non-physical. Now, if you're perplexed by that, that's something you should be perplexed by, right? Because it's not exactly clear how that works.
I can conceive of existing without my body. I mean, in a way, like we might not be able to move or grab something or eat or run, but we can simply exist.
Yeah.
Just exist.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Right. You think of these terrifying descriptions of locked-in syndrome, right? Where somebody's completely paralyzed, and yet they're still conscious. They can't say anything, they can't move. Now that obviously involves a physical body, but you're imagining this kind of existence, which is almost just purely mental, because you no longer have any access to the physical body, right? You can't move, you can't do anything, you can't say anything, you can't move your eyes. It's crazy, but there's still, like, the lights are still on. There's still a mental life occurring in that state of paralysis. And so it seems like, yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe I could conceive of this mind existing without my body. So, the standard thing is like outer body experiences. At the very least, it seems like, hey, I can conceive of going outside of my body and looking at myself from the outside. You may have even had such experience. We're actually able to reproduce these in laboratories now. We know sort of how it works, and we can get you to have an outer body experience in the laboratory itself. And what it seems like in an experience like that is that you're looking at yourself from the outside in, right? You're like a disincarnate mind observing your body. And what Descartes wants to say is, hey, that's totally conceivable, right? Now, so let me give you sort of a different sort of example. So we just did, like, you get up and you look in the mirror and you're not there, right? So we can imagine you existing without your body. But now imagine the desk on which your electronic device is seated, set upon right now, right? You've got a desk. I want you to try and imagine a world in which the desk exists, but it's not a desk, but there's no desk. Can you imagine that? Can you conceive of that experience? Sorry, it's not an experience. Can you conceive of that existing, right? There's a desk, but there's no desk. Seems like no, right? That seems like a contradiction. If you can't conceive of the desk without the desk, right? That's not even conceivable. If there's no desk, then there's just simply no desk. You can't conceive of the desk being present without the desk being present. So that seems like a contradiction, right? You can't actually conceive of that. You can conceive of the mind existing without the body. That's perfectly picturable. We've got a clear idea of what that might mean. But we can't conceive of a physical body existing without a physical body, right? Because in that case, we've removed what's essential to the idea of being a physical body, namely being an extended body in space. If you've got no extended body in space, then you've got no physical body. So you can't conceive of being a physical body while not being a physical body. But you can conceive of being a mind without being a physical body, because being extended in space is not essential to what it means to be a mind. It's a different sort of thing. And this is what makes it conceivable. This is what allows us to picture it in our minds and tell stories about it, is because it really is a different sort of thing. fundamentally. Right, and all this is what Descartes' doing with his dream doubt, and the evil demon doubt is saying, hey, look, I can doubt all the physical stuff, but I still can't doubt that I exist, right? Everything physical is unreal. That's what Descartes is essentially just pretending for a time in order to show that what he is conceiving of in regards to his own existence is something essentially separate from the physical world. And since I can conceive of that, it shows that what my mind is essentially is really distinct from the body. They're two fundamentally different sorts of things. The mind is a non-physical substance, the body is a physical substance. And that's Descartes' argument for substance dualism. Can the body exist without the mind? Is it possible that I exist with a body but no mind? It doesn't seem like that works, right? How could I exist with a body but no mind? It seems like what is essential to me existing is my mental existence. If I existed without a mind, then I'd just be a corpse, right? There'd be no one there to be doing anything. But it's entirely conceivable that a body exists without a mind. Think of zombies, for instance, right? Zombies are like, they're almost physically identical to human beings, but there's really no mind there in the zombie. Yeah. There's nothing that's like for the zombie to be a zombie, supposedly. I guess zombies work out a little bit different in fiction, but the idea here is that, you could have like an identical replication of your physical body, right? So take your physical body and we duplicate it in every single way. You can imagine there is a being who has the very same physical structure and constitution as you, but has no mind. So it's a kind of a philosophical zombie as opposed to an apocalyptic zombie, right? It's a philosophical zombie in that it's a physical being which acts just like a human being, which talks just like a human being. When you prick it, it says, ouch, hey, don't poke me. We can imagine a being like that where there's actually no conscious experience at all. The lights just aren't on. Maybe we get there with AI, right? And we construct a robot which is identical to a human being in every single way. So it talks like a human being, it moves like a human being, it does all sorts of human sorts of things, such that we'd want to just say, hey, that seems like a human being, and yet there's no consciousness, right? There's nothing it's like to be that thing. So if philosophical zombies are conceivable, that seems to show that, hey, there really is a difference between being a body and being a mind. They must really be distinct. And the real sort of lesson here is that I'm not my body. That being a person and being a human being are not the same sorts of things, which is a little weird if you think about it at first, because normally we just think of persons as human beings. But we can have persons who aren't human beings, right? Being a human being is being a member of a physical species, right? Of a biological species. But if substance dualism is correct, then I'm not my body. So what I am is not fundamentally a human being. That describes my sort of physical existence. But what I essentially am, in terms of my personhood, in terms of my identity, in terms of myself, my fundamental nature, is a thinking being. That's what I am as a person. In fact, I could be a thinking being without being a human being. Yeah. So I don't know. What do you think about these premises? I can conceive of existing without my body, and I can conceive of existing without my mind. So they really must be separate and distinct. Two different sorts of substances. Does anyone want to jump in here? Yeah, near-death experiences. Those are good examples of conceiving of existing without the body. Well, let me hit this really quick and then we'll return to it next time. Here's one possible objection to this argument, which is what Thomas, I think, was getting at earlier on. And this is the idea, this is the objection, which says that logical possibility does not necessarily equal metaphysical possibility. So just because we can conceive of something doesn't mean that that thing we conceived of could really exist in that way. So just because something is logically possible doesn't mean that it's metaphysically possible. Let me try and do this really quick. I normally take a little bit more time on this, but we'll try and return to it next time. So suppose, for instance, that you're walking down a very dark alley, the black of night, right? Kind of worried, in fact, a little bit. And then a hooded figure comes out from the corner, right? And says, give me your wallet, give me all your money, give me everything you got, right? Crap. Okay, so you're quickly just trying to avoid this terrible situation, right? Give the robber what they want and try and get out of there. And then suddenly Batman swoops down and thwarts the evil robber from doing their malicious deed. Yeah. And you say, thank God Batman has come to the rescue and has thwarted this malicious robber. And you say, my God, what a state our city is in. I know some people don't like Batman because he's a vigilante, but man, who else is going to clean things up? Batman seems to be the only one willing to do so. And you say, and think of these like rich billionaires like Bruce Wayne, who are up in their rich mansions, having their elaborate parties with the elite of Gotham, and they don't care anything about what's happening to the poor people down on the level of the street. Thank God we've got Batman here. So clearly in a case like that, I don't think that Bruce Wayne was the one who thwarted the robber, right? In fact, I've got a really poor opinion of Bruce Wayne. I think he's a part of that 1%. They don't care anything about what happens to the ordinary people of Gotham. Thank God we've got Batman, right? So it seems like in that scenario, I've got a perfectly logical conception in my mind, right? Batman isn't Bruce Wayne, right? That seems to be what I'm thinking of, the state of affairs that I'm imagining. Batman isn't Bruce Wayne. Batman's way better than Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is one of those 1% elitists, right? Doesn't care about us. Batman's actually down here on the street taking care of things. So if I can conceive of it, doesn't it mean it really is that way? Or at least really could be that way? Well, of course, this is conceivable. It's conceivable, but so it's logically possible that that Batman isn't Bruce Wayne, but it's not really that way, right? It's not metaphysically possible. It can't really turn out to be that way. If unknown to me, Batman really just is Bruce Wayne, then it's not metaphysically, then it's metaphysically impossible that Bruce Wayne is not Batman. So I've conceived of it. It seems logically possible, but it couldn't really be that way if, in fact, Batman is Bruce Wayne. Then what I'm imagining is logically conceivable, perfectly possible, but it's not metaphysically possible given who Batman really is. Right? It couldn't really actually turn out that way. So in some sense, I'm not even really imagining Batman as not being Bruce Wayne. It's actually not really imaginable. It seems like it, but metaphysically, that's not possible. So likewise, if unknown to me, the mind really is the brain, and I just don't know that, I don't know about that identity between the mind and the brain, then I'm not really imagining my mind without a body, right? That's actually not really metaphysically what I'm conceiving of, if the mind really is the brain. So the idea here is to go back to that first premise, and say, hey, anything that is conceivable is also logically possible. Yeah, that might be the case, but can we infer from there that the mind really are separate and distinct metaphysically? That seems like a further step, which isn't necessarily entailed by our imagining existing without a body. Because if the mind is really identical to the body, then what we're imagining couldn't really be the case. Okay, so let's move into the divisibility argument for substance dualism then. And here's the passage in which this second argument occurs. Take a look at this for a moment. Let me see if I can move this out of the way. Okay, mind differs importantly from body in that body is by its nature divisible while mind is indivisible. When I think about my mind, or in other words, about myself, insofar as I am just a thinking thing, I can't distinguish any parts. I understand myself to be a single, unified thing. Although my whole mind seems united to my whole body, I know that cutting off a foot, arm, or other limb would not take anything away from my mind. And the abilities to will, sense, understand can't be called parts, since it is one and the same mind that wills, senses, and understands. On the other hand, whenever I think of a physical or extended thing, I can mentally divide it, and I therefore understand that the object is divisible. This single fact would be enough to teach me that my mind and body are distinct if I hadn't already gained that knowledge. Okay. The single fact would be enough to teach me that my mind and body are distinct if I hadn't already gained that knowledge. So what's the gist of Descartes' argument here? Can you make it out? What's he saying? The body can be divided into parts, so it's divisible, while the mind is indivisible. It doesn't seem to be able to be broken down into particular parts. And he's arguing, hey, well, since the body is divisible and the mind is indivisible, they must be different things. They must be different sorts of things. So here's the argument. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, I think. Premise one, the body by its very nature is divisible. Premise two, the mind by its very nature is indivisible. I think there's something like a hidden premise here, an implicit premise. So I'm adding this one in. Descartes doesn't explicitly state this, but I think he intends something like this. Something can't be both divisible and indivisible at the same time, right? So if the body is divisible and the mind is indivisible, and something can't be both divisible and indivisible simultaneously, then it follows that the mind is completely separate and distinct from the body. They're two different substances. The mind is a mental, non-physical substance. The body is a physical, extended substance. And this is actually a further argument that Descartes could give in response to, hey, logical possibility doesn't entail metaphysical possibility. Okay, well, let me give you a further argument for thinking that the mind really is fundamentally separate and distinct from the body. It looks like if the body, by its very nature, if in its essence it's divisible, and the mind by its very essence or nature is indivisible, then don't they have to be different things? Don't they have to be separate? I suppose the curious premise here is premise number two. The mind by its very nature is indivisible. What does Descartes mean when he says the mind by its very nature is indivisible? Does that make sense? Do you have a sense of what he's getting at there? He's saying, let's look at this. So sometimes this is put in the philosophy of mind as the unity of consciousness, the fact of the unity of consciousness. And this is something that Descartes recognizes, and it's something that philosophers from Descartes onwards spend a lot of time thinking about. It's a very interesting fact about consciousness, or at least so it seems. So we'll start with the first premise here, which I think most of us can get on board with, which is the body by its very nature is divisible, right? So for instance, if I take a stick of butter, I can cut that into smaller pieces of butter. And I can continue dividing it up and breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts. And you might even think, well, maybe you hit like atoms at some point, right? Atoms are supposed to be like physical fundamentals. But we're finding that, we've got subatomic, the subatomic level, the quantum field, like, it just gets crazier as you go further down, and you keep diving into the microscopic nature of reality. So anything physical can be divided into smaller parts. That really does seem to be a principle that holds kind of generally for physical bodies, right? So we can dissect them, we can figure out how their particular parts work, we can put them back together again in many instances as well. Okay, so not too bad with the first premise there. I think most of us are probably on board with that. But what about premise 2? The mind by its very nature is indivisible. What exactly does that mean? The idea is something like this. Think about any conscious experience you're having at any time, right? The conscious experience you're having right now. There's a lot going on in your experience, and it all seems to just occur at once as a unity, right? So in any particular conscious experience, there's going to be a lot going on in that conscious experience. You might have certain feelings that you are feeling, certain thoughts running through your mind, certain visual impressions that you are receiving from the environment. And it's all happening at once as a unity, right? So think about your awareness right now. Just reflect on your experience. You probably have some device which is in front of you that you're listening to the lecture on, but I'm sure there's some things off in the distance, just a little bit further. Maybe there's like a poster on the wall, or a doorway, or a bookshelf, or something that you're looking at off in the distance. And you're probably most immediately aware of what your attention is focused on, namely probably the device here to listen to the lecture. Hopefully that's what you're doing. You might actually be paying attention to something entirely different. But so if you're aware of A and you're aware of B, then you're aware of both of them, right? You're aware of what's happening right in front of you, but you're also kind of aware of what's happening on the periphery of your consciousness. Yeah. In fact, there might even be sort of thoughts running in the back of your head. You're daydreaming about what you're going to do later in the day and not really paying attention to the lecture, right? But you've got both of these things going on simultaneously in your mind. You're aware of both of them at the same time. And the idea is there's a kind of a single perspective from which you are getting everything right now. It all comes to you as a unity, as one thing. That single perspective from which you take in all of your environment and also all of your internal world is a kind of unity, right? And you can think about this. Would it make sense for me is it possible for me to break down my mental experiences into smaller parts in the way in which I can break down a physical thing? Because you might say something like, hey, yeah, well, I'm aware of certain things in my experience, like what is right in front of me, and I could just focus on that. So doesn't that show that there are aspects of the mind which are divisible from other aspects? Well, not really, right? Because even if you just focus on that one thing, everything else that occurs in your conscious experience, right, it's going to be occurring simultaneously. There's no way to break it apart and understand it separately from what's going on in your experience, right? So when you perceive, for instance, the color red, you perceive a beautiful red rose. Well, you're never just purely perceiving the color red, right? It's always connected with a host of other perceptions or sensations or thoughts. And it all comes to you at once as this package deal. So it might be that there are different aspects of your experience right now, but it's all your experience. And we don't seem to be able to dissect a conscious experience in the way that we can a physical body, right? We can't break it down into component parts. It's all there at once. And this is kind of a puzzling feature about conscious experience, is that it seems unified, right? Whenever it's occurring, there seems to be a kind of unity that enables it all to hang together in the way that we don't get with the physical body, right? So for instance, we can understand the brain biologically. We can bust it down into its component parts, figure out how all the individual parts work, then build them back together again, and get a better, more comprehensive picture of how the brain as a whole functions. Right? And it's really cool and very powerful. And the way in which we understand a lot of physical systems is by understanding the component parts and then understanding how those component parts interact with each other. And that's something we can very much do with the brain. But it doesn't seem to be something we can do with the mind, with our experience, right? We don't seem to be able to explain the unity of consciousness in biological terms. That is, I mean, I could tell you about the parts of the brain which are maybe involved in a visual experience, but that's not getting at the visual experience itself, right? The visual experience comes as a unity, and it doesn't seem to be accessible to us in the way that the brain is accessible. It seems to only be accessible through our own individual experience, our own introspection, or through the reports that other people might give about it. Right? So if the body is divisible and the mind really is indivisible, if consciousness is a unity, then something can't be both divisible and indivisible at the same time, and the mind is separate and distinct from the body. Does that make sense? This idea of the unity of consciousness, that the mind is indivisible, but the body is divisible. Do you agree with that? Does that make sense to you? Yeah, no, it's a tricky idea to wrap your head around if you haven't sort of considered this before. I mean, if you just take any conscious experience, the experience is there. All of the elements of that experience are there together. And it's not like you gain a better understanding of the unity of your experience by breaking down the particular parts of your experience and then building them back up together again in the way that you would do with the physical brain, right? Because in your experience, it's just all there at once as a unity. And if that's true, if the mind really is a unity, then it seems like it's not divisible. And so it really is separate and distinct from the body. Yeah, so the trick there is to say, you want to say, hey, look, there's all this physical stuff going on in my body. When I'm hungry, I feel hungry. And there's a physical process there, which is resulting in me feeling hungry. Now, the trick here is to see that your feeling hungry is something that you experience from your first person perspective, right? You have the sensation of being hungry. There's something that it's like for you to feel hungry. If you just take the experience of hunger, right? And you don't have to know how physiology works to understand that you're hungry. You might have zero knowledge of anatomy and still have a very intense and real experience of hunger, right? And you have access to that experience directly through your own introspection. Now, you might say, well, I can give you an explanation for why that hunger arises, but it's still not explaining why there's anything at all it's like to be hungry. Like, what is this conscious experience of hunger itself? Right? You seem to want to be saying, well, if I just give you the physical explanation of what's going on in my body when I'm hungry, then that explains everything there is to know about the experience of hunger. Let's suppose, though, for a second, that you had a race of Martians, and Martians don't have to eat, right? They don't have to eat, so they never experience hunger. They never have the conscious experience of hunger. And you give them our best textbooks, our best scientists, you send them up, and we send them to the Martian planet, and they tell them everything that there is to know about the physiological and biological processes of being hungry. Are those Martians who have never experienced hunger in their life going to then know what the experience of hunger is like? I mean, you might think there's an open question there, but on the face of it, it seems like, well, if you've never experienced it, and so that shows that there's actually something different between just the physical explanation that I'm going to give to you of the phenomena and actually having the experience itself. And so we can use that same response to the unity of consciousness and say, hey, I can give to you an explanation of what's going on in the brain and maybe a compelling explanation for how consciousness is unified, but I can't tell you why consciousness is unified. I can't give you the experience of the unity of consciousness through a physical explanation of the brain alone, because the mind, that experience, doesn't seem to be analyzable in the same way as the body or the brain. Right? So that's the idea there. Now, I think there is room to push back and to say, hey, maybe if I gave you all the physical facts, then you would know what the unity of consciousness is like. But some further arguments would need to be given there to figure that out. Here's another possible objection. And I'm going to do this real quick. Hopefully this makes sense. There's these really interesting cases in the empirical literature, sometimes known as split brain syndrome. And the idea is that, okay, so there are patients who suffer from severe epilepsy. And sometimes the seizures are so severe and other medical intervention is not working. And so what has to happen is that the large transverse band of nerve fibers connecting the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, known as the corpus callosum, is severed, right? And what that's intended to do is to prevent sort of the misfiring of the left and the right hemisphere, which is the result of these epileptic seizures, right? And again, this happens only happens in very severe cases, but this experiment has been performed many times. And when it was first starting to be performed, no really noticeable side effects occurred. But then over time, case literature began to develop. And what people were noticing was that the left and the right hemisphere began operating as if they contained their own separate spheres of consciousness. Right? So one very basic way in which this would happen is, so what you perceive out of your left eye, right, out of your left visual field, it's actually out of the left portion of your left eye, communicates to your right hemisphere, right? And it's purely visual. So it's not in most cases, it's not the verbal centers of your brain which are being activated when you perceive something out of the left visual field. When you perceive something out of the right visual field, it communicates to the left hemisphere, and that processes things in terms of language, right? And so once this commissurotomy is the name of the operation, where you sever the corpus callosum so that the left and the right hemisphere no longer communicate with each other, what was seen to happen is that if you were to put something in somebody's left visual field, they would register the image, but they wouldn't be able to tell you what they saw. They couldn't actually explain to you what they had seen. So if you put in front of them a toy car and you say, hey, what did you see? They would say, I didn't see anything. There's nothing I saw. And so a part of the reason for that is that their verbal center is gone. And so they actually can't give the report about something that they saw. But if you gave them, let's say, a chart where you had, a tree and a bicycle and a car, and you would say, pick which one was shown to you, every time they'll pick the right one. They'll pick the car. They can't tell you what they saw, but they'll pick the right one because their right hemisphere is processing the visual image. Okay, so that's a really interesting case. It looks like the right hemisphere is processing things and knowing about things in a very different way that the left hemisphere is. Most of the time they're in communication with each other, but when you perform this experiment, they kind of operate on their own. To give you a really stark example of this, one case was of a man who had this performed, this commissurotomy, and he began to act very erratically. One instance, he grabbed his wife aggressively with his left hand. Was very upset with her, grabbed her, was physically aggressive with her. Then with his right hand, he tried to stop himself from doing this. His left hemisphere thought it was okay to behave towards his wife in this way. His right hemisphere thought it was wrong and tried to stop him from doing it, almost as if there were two separate selves in the one person. The same person had this problem that when he woke up in the morning, his left hand would start, when he was getting dressed, would pull up his pants and getting ready for the day, and his right hand would pull the pants down, not wanting to get up and start the day, wanted to go back to bed. So it looked like there were these two different selves within the one consciousness, right? If that even makes sense. I mean, in fact, some of the interpretations that came out of this literature is that it looks like there's two separate spheres of consciousness that are produced from the one. That interpretation of the empirical data is slightly controversial. It's not exactly clear how we should interpret those cases. But if two separate spheres of consciousness were in fact produced, then it kind of looks like the mind is divisible, like it could be divided. Now, notice we're not just talking about the division of the brain. What we're talking about now are two separate personalities which exist within the one person, right? So now that's a strange situation. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with that literature. I mean, even that's not right. I'm not familiar with that literature, right, by a long shot. But I do know that in cases of dissociative identity disorder, this is a very real phenomenon, that people can be operating as two different personalities at different times. Now, those are very extreme cases, but it does seem like there are separate spheres of consciousness, separate personalities, or you might even say separate selves in an individual person. And so you might think, hey, well, if that could be the case, then it looks like maybe the mind is divisible. And notice here, we're still not talking about just the division of the brain, even though this operation does occur where the corpus callosum is severed. The result of that is two spheres of consciousness, right? Two selves. So there might actually even be a response that the dualist could give here and say that if each of the resulting consciousnesses are really independent of each other, then each is, again, its own unity, right? Because you have two separate selves. In the case of dissociative identity disorder, you might think, hey, those different selves they have their own unity of consciousness. Each of them is its own self. And so that actually pushes the problem back just a little bit, and we still have to explain the unity of consciousness. Okay, so really what I'm trying to do here is just get you to sort of start thinking of some of the implications here of what Descartes is saying. And again, I'm trying to plant some seeds that I think will hopefully come to fruition a little bit later in the course. So if this is a little weird to you at this point, that's okay. But let's look at this argument just one more time. The body by its very nature is divisible. The mind by its very nature is indivisible. Something can't be both divisible and indivisible at the same time. Therefore, the mind is completely separate and distinct from the body. That's Descartes' final argument for substance dualism. Okay. Let's take a look at some of the challenges for dualism on a more global level. We've looked at some particular arguments, kind of got into the weeds there with them a little bit. We'll return to some of these themes later in the course, but right now let's just think about the state of dualism generally. So one issue with substance dualism is that it gives rise to what is known as the mind-body problem. Okay, so what's the mind-body problem? The mind-body problem is this question: how can these two fundamentally different sorts of substances with completely different natures causally interact so as to give rise to a human being capable of having voluntarily bodily emotions and sensations? In other words, if the mind and the body are completely distinct, how do they interact with each other? Because it seems like my mind can cause changes to my body. So I was doing this yesterday where I was raising my hand, right, and trying to demonstrate this relationship between the mind and the body. So I raised my hand. I can explain the raising of my hand in purely physical terms, in terms of what's going on in my brain, how that is leading to the contraction of muscles in my arm, and so forth, and eventually results in the raising of the hand. But there also seems to be a mental event or a mental process involved in that. Namely, when I decide to raise my hand for the purpose of some philosophical exposition, right? So there's a mental event. I decide to raise my hand. Well, how does my deciding, seemingly purely mental event, give rise or cause a physical event to occur? If the mind is a different sort of thing, how is it causally interacting with the body? In terms of physical causation, this seems kind of clear, right? So the classical example is you have billiard balls on a pool table, right? And you hit the cue ball hits the 8 ball goes into the corner pocket. You can understand how the chain of causation works there. You have one physical object with a surface and another physical object with a surface, and one slams into the other one at a certain force and transfers that force via the surface, right? Via the surface of the object, so it moves too. But in the case of the mind, the substance dualist holds that the mind is non-physical. So the mind doesn't have any surfaces. It's not extended in space. So how could it be that it causally interacts with the body? How can something that's not extended in space causally interact with something that is extended? Seems puzzling, a little bit mysterious. How can a non-physical substance causally interact with a physical substance? If they are two completely separate and distinct types of stuff, it seems almost impossible for them to interact with each other. Okay, that's the mind-body problem. It's a difficult problem if you're a substance dualist. It's also a difficult problem even if you're a materialist at some level, because you still have to give an account of how these mental experiences can cause changes to the physical body and how the physical body can cause changes to the mind. Now, if you want to argue against dualism, you might say something like this: if the mind and the body were truly separate and distinct, then causal interaction between them seems impossible. How can something non-physical causally interact with something that is physical? Premise 2, but causal interaction between the mind and the body is possible. It occurs all the time, right? It's constantly happening. So if it occurs all the time, and it would be impossible on the picture of substance dualism, then the mind and body are not separate and distinct, and substance dualism is false. So somebody who is a physicalist about the nature of the mind, which I've heard a couple of you express such a sentiment already, namely that the mind really is entirely physical. A physicalist about the mind might give an argument like this to try and refute something like substance dualism. Right? So that's the mind-body problem. How do the mind and the body interact? That's kind of a very deep and difficult problem for the substance dualist. But I do want to point out that Descartes' arguments are very powerful. And they do, in fact, show, I think, that there is a difference between the mind and the body, at least at one level of explanation. And most philosophers, I think, would agree with Descartes that the arguments that he gives are very powerful arguments against a straightforward type of physicalism, where we say something like the mind just is the brain. Right? Here are the arguments that we've looked at so far. In summary, knowledge of your own existence is more certain than knowledge of any material thing. And since you can know your own existence more certainly than any material thing, it follows that your existence is in some sense more fundamental, right? It's its own sort of thing. Another argument, the conceivability argument, you can conceive of the self without the body. So the body and the self are separate. Or the divisibility argument, matter is divisible, but the self is indivisible. It's one. All of these are arguments that Descartes gives for dualism. And as I was saying, they are powerful arguments for why the mind can't be physical. And most philosophers think that there really is something to grapple with here. The problem I think that Descartes makes is that he uses these arguments to say that the mind is something that is non-physical. But that doesn't quite seem to be borne out by the arguments themselves. In fact, you can use these very arguments to also make a case that the mind isn't non-physical. Right? So Descartes thinks, hey, these are arguments for dualism. These are arguments for the position that the mind is a non-physical substance. But what I want to try and show you right now is that these very same arguments can be arguments against dualism. Right? Because knowledge of your own existence is more certain than any knowledge you have of a non-physical thing. Right? Yeah, you're able to doubt that you have a physical body, and you have this seemingly certain knowledge of your own existence, but why think that that existence is a non-physical existence? Right? Your knowledge of your existence is more certain than your knowledge that there is a non-physical substance in the universe. Right? I mean, I suppose Descartes just wants to say you are a non-physical thing, but that's not exactly what we learn, right? When we learn of our own existence, it's not exactly clear that what we're discovering there is a non-physical thing. That almost seems like a further step. And that's what Descartes wants to say, is that that gives you knowledge of a non-physical thing, but your knowledge of your own existence is separate from your knowledge of any non-physical thing. Likewise, you can conceive of the self without a non-physical substance. So self and non-physical substance are separate from each other, right? In other words, why do you need a non-physical substance in order to conceive of a self? Yeah, you can conceive of a self existing without conceiving of a non-physical substance, or so it seems, right? Your existence is just self-evident. The nature of that existence, we don't know what the nature of that existence is. Descartes wants to say it's non-physical, but why think it's non-physical? Is that really borne out by the data that we have from our own experience? And likewise, you can say, hey, look, substances are divisible, but the self is indivisible. This is maybe pushing it a little bit far, but Descartes says the mind is a non-physical thing. It's a non-physical substance, right? But you might think, hey, if it's a substance, aren't substances by definition divisible things? Now, Descartes wants to say the mind is a special sort of substance, so maybe he can push back on this, but hopefully you can still see, like, why think that from the indivisibility of the self, we can say that there really is a non-physical fundamental sort of thing in the world. So all of the arguments that Descartes uses to try and establish dualism also seem to be able to be used as arguments against dualism. But again, I want to point out here that the arguments here are powerful arguments, right? He really is onto something. He's really showing that there does seem to be some kind of distinction between mind and matter. Now, what we make of that, I think, is still open for interpretation here. And we're going to spend the next 3 weeks trying to work this out. How should we really think about this difference between the mind and the body? Is that a difference which is just an apparent difference, which will disappear once we understand the fundamental nature of the mind or the body? Or is there really a fundamental difference that has to be maintained? Those are the questions we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks.